Good day again, Jillian and Jonathan. We are continuing with our discussion of Ronald Reagan. So I suppose this is lecture 5 for American History 2. I talked about Ronald Reagan's economic philosophy, supply-side economics, cutting taxes, putting money in people's pockets, as they would say, and then they spend that money that they've saved on their taxes, and it stimulates production and hiring, and it's a virtuous cycle that speeds up the economy, and that does happen. Supply-side economics, though, was also supposed to increase the tax base. As people made more money, they were going to be taxed on that money, and it was going to make up the difference, and it didn't really do that. But the economy did begin to roar in the 80s for some. There was, for the first time, really, and many people say it's really continued ever since, an increasing bifurcation, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Now, a lot of people qualified in that upper half. A lot of the middle class in America did prosper more in the 1980s. There's no question about that. You'll see, perhaps, if you're watching old shows about the 80s, a term yuppie, young urban professional, is what it is. So, hippie, but instead of hip, it's yup, young urban professional. And you can see some movies from the 80s that highlight this, this young person who's moved to New York City usually, and they're making a lot of money on Wall Street or, usually Wall Street, but our lawyers. L.A. Law was a popular program that came on in the late 80s. That was very typical. These, lawyers and stockbrokers and the like making good money, and young, attractive people on TV, driving around in BMWs. Those are the yuppies, they were called. But this is an indication that a lot of people did do very well economically in the 80s. There was much discussion, though, about a sort of growing underclass, or at least the working class wasn't keeping up as much. The money was disproportionately perhaps going to the higher income brackets. And some people would say that trend has continued to this very day. And there's some statistics to support that. But incidentally, the anti-tax trend was widespread in America. One sort of very clear indication of this was Proposition 13 in California. You'll remember we talked about the progressive era. One of the things they put in place was the proposition, where any citizen could start a petition and petition to have a law put before the voters for them to vote on as a whole, and it becomes law or a constitutional amendment to their state constitution. Proposition 13 is a guy named, I think his name was Jarvis. Can't think about what his first name was now. But he led a tax revolt in California because he said property taxes were simply too high in California. And in California, he got Proposition 13 passed, made part of their constitution, the state constitution, which put a big cap on the amount of taxes that could be demanded of Californians. And the government of California is a pretty big bureaucracy in its own right, and they had to slash the budget. And for many, many, many years, you heard stories about California's, people who had gotten benefits from the state of California's programs weren't going to get them anymore because of Proposition 13, the tax cap. That was in 1978, so 3 years before Reagan is trying to do something similar, cutting taxes and shrinking the size of the federal government deficit. Ronald Reagan in his first term proposed $35 billion in cuts in domestic federal spending. Remember, he did propose very great increases in defense spending, but this was in part to set off the defense spending, going to cut $35 billion. But one thing to keep in mind, there are programs that are called entitlement programs. These are things that are supposed to be kind of locked into the federal budget. You're entitled to them as an American citizen. One of those things is Social Security. Once you've paid into the Social Security system for, I think it's 6 quarters, it's a certain amount of time. You work a couple of years, and they've taken money and put it into the system from your paycheck, you're vested in Social Security, and you're entitled to get at least the minimum Social Security check. when you reach age 65 or 62. And that's an entitlement. You're entitled to that money. Since those things are entitlements, they shouldn't be able to be cut. But there's a huge amount of the federal budget is entitlements, veterans programs, things like that. Almost everybody says, hey, these are good things. Let's not cut those. Well, if that's a big chunk of the federal budget and another big chunk of the defense budget, which you actually want to grow instead of shrink, that leaves the discretionary budget you can chop into is actually pretty small. Not nearly big enough to make huge chops in without really feeling the pain on a lot of programs. And so there was a big debate. There always is a big debate. I mean, people talk about cutting the federal budget, but it is somebody's going to get hurt. Somebody's not going to get something they're used to getting, maybe something they actually need. Because there's, as I say, once you take the entitlements off the table, and almost nobody talks about cutting massive amounts from the defense budget, that leaves just maybe a third of the budget of the federal government that can even be tinkered with. So there was a big fight. In the end, Reagan didn't have enough Republican votes to get this bill through. So he had to rely on conservative Southern Democrats, the so-called boll weevil Democrats, who sided with Reagan in these fights in his first term. A good number of them actually converted to the Republican Party. Remember, I told you that for most of our history, the South was solidly Democratic. But that began to change with Richard Nixon. The election of 1968, the election of 1972 was even more pro-Republican, at least pro-Nixon in the American South. And this turn, the Southern strategy of Nixon had paid off. Now, Jimmy Carter did staunch it for a while. In 1976, he was a Southern himself, a Georgian, right? But remember, Reagan carried all of the South except for Georgia. And the Republicans have pretty much carried most of the South in every presidential election since 1980. And the Democratic Party is a shadow of its former self in the South, at least among white voters. African Americans have stayed pretty loyal to the Democratic Party in the South, but not white voters. Most white voters in the South vote Republican. So a lot of these boll weevil Democrats would flop parties. Phil Gramm was a Republican congressman from Democratic congressman from Texas, who became a Republican congressman from Texas, changed parties, then eventually became our senator for a couple of decades. As a Republican. So this is when Ronald Reagan's one who cements the Republican South we know today. All right. So we talked about the relative successes of the economic strategy of Ronald Reagan's first term. Talked about the defense buildup. But one part of his defense buildup that was brand new, building a much bigger Navy, beefing up on land forces, developing the B-1 and then the stealth bomber for the Air Force. All those are conventional things to do with the military. But he had an idea that he began pouring money into that some people would credit more than anything else of ending the Cold War. And that was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. That was his formal name. But people jokingly began referring to it as Star Wars. You'll recall that this is, I guess, the first two movies had come out before Ronald Reagan was president, and the third came out in his first term. So Star Wars was on people's minds. And the idea of putting defensive weapons in space, people called it the Star Wars program. But the idea was simple in theory and very difficult in practice. When an enemy launched a missile at the United States, we were going to shoot that missile down from outer space. Platforms of satellites up there in space with missiles to shoot down the rockets that are coming towards us, to kill them before they get here to drop nuclear bombs on us. Or, and this actually proved to be the most effective part of it, using rockets and even lasers from the ground to shoot the missiles down from the surface of the earth, not from the sky. And I believe that that what portions of Star Wars that actually were built and are operational actually go that way. They're surface launched things that are meant to shoot down the missiles. But this idea that we could shoot them down in space before they came back to bomb us, these thermonuclear missiles. Star Wars. Now, as I say, this took a great deal of scientific work, and it was well into the 80s, well into the 90s, well after Ronald Reagan had left office, before any practical defensive weapon could possibly have been built. But he put a lot of money into it. And the Soviets thought we could do it. And we did. Eventually we did. It took longer than I think most people would have guessed in the early 80s when he first started talking about it. And it took a lot of money. But we developed the Star Wars technology that would work. And the Soviets thought we could. And this terrified them. What if we could shoot down their missiles before they hit the United States? This might leave them extremely vulnerable. And they didn't think they could spend the money. They knew their economy wouldn't support this kind of defense spending to overcome Star Wars or to develop their own Star Wars system. So eventually, when Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, he will begin serious arms talks with Ronald Reagan. And part of his demand was in Star Wars, and we'll cut the missiles. And Ronald Reagan wouldn't give up Star Wars. He thought it was very important. And so he wouldn't surrender Star Wars. So the Cold War kept going. But by the end of the 80s, late in Reagan's second term, with Gorbachev in the Kremlin in Moscow, they did begin to actually sign treaties to stop the growth of nuclear weapons and even cut some kinds of them. And what drove the Soviets to the table, what brought peace much closer with the Soviet Union, was in part Star Wars, and in part simply building up our military where we were a much tougher customer to deal with. And the Soviets knew it. They knew we could afford it, and they knew they couldn't. So that's what will end in the Cold War. There were other tensions, of course. As I say, the Soviet Union and the United States were very much still at daggers drawn in Reagan's first term. He was a traditional Cold Warrior, maybe a little more gung-ho than some before him had been in the White House. We certainly had moments of great tension. In September 1983, for example, a Korean Airlines plane flying from the United States to Korea strayed off course, apparently just an accident by the pilot, and wound up flying over the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union scrambled fighter jets and shot it down. Shot down a commercial passenger plane full of civilians over its airspace. I mean, the airspace had been violated by this Korean Airlines plane, but they killed all those people, including a number of Americans who were on the plane. And this really spiked tensions for quite a while. Yuri Andropov was the premier of the Soviet Union at that time. This was an era when the Soviet leadership were all geriatric, most of them in their 80s. And, they had been fighting the Cold War their whole careers. They were middle-aged men when the Cold War began, really. It's all they knew. This really were difficult times. I think we'll stop on this lecture there. I'll continue with the Sandinistas and other aspects of the Cold War in the next talk. Thanks, guys.